Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Atlantic Council think tank in Washington, D.C. at the conclusion of a fascinating panel discussion on space cooperation. And it's our honor to be interviewing the Executive Secretary of the reconstituted National Space Council, Dr. Scott Pace. Sir, great seeing you. We talked to you before taking office. Thanks very much for the time.
Glad to be here, Vago. Good to see you again.
Great to see you. First, let me ask you about the Space Council broadly. Reconstituted, something that Lyndon Johnson, when he was vice president, started. Or not Lyndon Johnson, right? It even predates that. It goes back to the Eisenhower administration. Talk to us about the important role you guys are filling, because there was a gap when you guys were disestablished.
Well, the Space Council really is something that depends on the interest of the president. Space Councils come and go depending on the president being interested. President Kennedy, of course, wanted a Space Council, wanted to elevate it, and that's why he took something that was under Eisenhower and he had the vice president chair it. Space was a priority for President George H.W. Bush, and so Vice President Dan Quayle, of course, chaired that. Space was going to be a priority for President Trump, and he decided to reconstitute the Space Council and has asked the Vice President to chair it. But each Space Council has dealt with a different environment. Of course, Kennedy dealt with the space race period and the challenge of the Soviet Union. President Bush dealt with the issue of the post-Cold War period, and so a lot of dual-use technology issues got dealt with by the Space Council then as we came off the Cold War. And President Trump is dealing with a world which is much more globalized in space, many more private sector actors, many more international people. So it's a much more complex environment, and so he's directed the Vice President to really take charge of the Space Council and to really align a lot of our activities, whether civil, military, commercial, international, such that they're mutually supporting U.S. interests in a much more complicated environment today than ever before.
As we know, right, a much more democratized environment. Nations that never had space capabilities are requiring it. Nano satellites, proliferation of spacecraft. We were talking in there about constellations that will be in the thousands, many thousands, and that ties into a question later about an increasingly crowded and polluted space. But a lot of the conversation was also on the great power competition between and among the United States, China, and Russia, our allies, as well as some of the nations that work with them. What are some of the specific, and we've talked about blinding, dazzling, jamming, kinetic effects, but what are some of the specific things that Russia and China, as two actors that have not that have more than somewhat disdain for the international rules-based order that's governed everybody's behavior, for example, in space? What are some of the things specifically they're doing that keep you and the team at the White House and others awake?
Well, I think we hopefully keep them awake, so it's not one-sided. But what's happened is Russia and China have separately come to conclusion, with some justification, that the United States is highly reliant on space. It's not only for our security, but also for our economy. And so both of them have decided that having the capability to attack our space systems or negate their effectiveness is going to be very important to them if there is a conflict in their region. So we've seen, of course, Russian behavior in Ukraine and in the Crimea, and of course there's concerns in the Baltic areas and so forth. So Europe is facing potential threats, and of course space is going to be part of those threats. China is a bit of a different situation. They have looked at using threats against space systems in order to deter the United States from being able to defend our friends and allies in the region. And of course we're committed to the defense of Japan, our key ally, defense of Australia, and defense of other countries in the region. So in both these cases they recognize that space is important to us and therefore holding at risk is going to be part of their calculus. And in both situations these actions have made space into a warfighting domain. In previous years space was literally so remote that you could operate there and really be removed from the conflict. In the era after 9/11, we of course used space to provide combat support to operations against global terrorism across the Middle East, particularly in terms of Afghanistan and Iraq. And there was not really a threat from Afghanistan and Iraq and from international terrorists against our space systems. But now we've re-entered an era of great power competition, and therefore in this situation we're finding that our assets in fact are at risk, that we do have to take actions to defend them. And one of the major steps toward that is simply recognizing that reality. So this administration has recognized space as a warfighting domain, a term that previous administrations were loath to use. One, because there is a reality that had not yet developed that way, but two, they're reluctant to recognize that threat that had occurred. This administration recognizes the threat. This administration is taking steps to mitigate that threat. Not only things such as standing up Space Command, but also, of course, putting together a proposal for a Space Force that would be a service dedicated to the space domain, reflecting the importance that the space domain has to the United States. And we've been moving out on that and other efforts. Probably one of the best unclassified reports you can read was mentioned by Steve Katay, was a Defense Intelligence Agency report that describes the wide variety of counter-space threats that can be used, as you said, direct attacks, blinding, jamming, dazzling, and so forth. So there's a number of things that we have to deal with. But learning how to operate in and through those kinds of threats is important to us. Deterring action. No one wants war in space. It is deeply, deeply against our interest to have a war in space. However, if we want to deter war, we have to be prepared for it, and that's what this administration is doing.
Let's go to how you compel China and Russia to abide by rules-based international order. EU and U.S. cooperation on space is improving. NATO has accepted space as a warfighting domain. As you mentioned, first time ever, the Atlantic Alliance sees itself as having a role in space. What's the best way to try to do this? Is it through compelling? Is it through technology? Is it through doctrine? What are the ways the United States is going to work with its allies in order to try to ensure that these two nations that live outside the international order remain in the international order as a way of deterrence and more?
Well, I don't think it's quite fair to say they live outside the international order. I think it's more subtle than that, in that they have shown a willingness to violate the terms of norms of behavior if they feel it's in their national security interests. And of course, what we want to do is we want to persuade them and all nations to abide by a peaceful international order. Now, compelling a sovereign state short of military force is basically unlikely. So what we do today is a couple of things. One is we try to first create norms of behavior. We've had norms of behavior on the high seas for a long time. Ships passing on the right, coming to aid of others, deferring to other vessels, and so forth, that have been developed over hundreds, if not thousands of years. Space is relatively younger. We're trying to develop norms of behavior with others on what space safety looks like, what safe operations look like. A major step toward that occurred just this year with the United Nations adopting 21 guidelines, non-binding, voluntary guidelines, but guidelines nonetheless that were passed by the General Assembly on how we can operate in space more safely. These build on earlier guidelines, such as the ones for mitigating space debris, not creating more hazards in space. So I think there's a good role for the United Nations in voluntary discussions, but ultimately sovereign states are responsible for their own defense. And so the ultimate guarantee of peace and security is going to be the strength of the United States and the strength of our alliances with others, such that no nation, wherever they may be, feels that it's possible to win against the United States and therefore would be tempted to engage in escalatory or hazardous behavior. Ultimately, peace is through deterrence. And the way we can deter bad actions in space is by convincing others through demonstrations of our capability and development of our alliances that there's no way that one could win, and therefore to maintain the peace.
Do you see, when it comes to Europe, the EU, or even our Asian partners, do you see more multinational, multilateral agreements or more bilateral agreements? The administration has been somewhat skeptical about multinational agreements. What do you think the best way to try to do this is with allies and partners that are very like-minded?
Well, it depends on the nature of the kind of agreement you're thinking of. In the case of military alliances, those of course have to be straight agreements at the highest levels between governments. So building on the U.S.-Japan relationship, strengthening NATO, strengthening our alliances with other key partners. So those are done through much more formal agreements, government to government. What's happening in the area of norms of behavior, we're looking to build really from the bottom up. I mentioned orbital debris mitigation guidelines. Well, those things are ones that were developed by best practice, by those who actually are operating in space. We're looking at ways, as we look towards, say, servicing satellites and having satellites work and rendezvous with each other. What is the normal best way for that to happen? How close do you approach? When do you give warning? How do you give notice? These standard practice of what we might on the high seas consider maritime rules. Well, we want to have those same rules for space. Now, that doesn't mean that will ensure peace, but it means if someone violates those norms, then we know something else is going on. And so as a way of making the space environment more predictable and more stable, voluntary bottom-up norms of behavior discussed in a multilateral context, but enforced by individual nation states, we think is the way to go.
Of course, there are Chinese and Russian spacecraft that come in perilously close proximity with some of our spacecraft, which has been a little bit of a challenge. Let me ask you about the role for cooperation, particularly with Russia and China. We are cooperating despite tensions throughout the Cold War, and even at the very height of the Cold War, we cooperated with the then Soviet Union. There was the Apollo-Soyuz test program we used, and other sort of efforts that were ongoing, eventually using Russian space stations, for example, and we now depend on the Soyuz spacecraft in order to get to orbit to access the International Space Station until our manned launch vehicles or launch systems and space systems are up and running. What's the role for constructive, positive civil space cooperation, be it with Russia and be it with China as well? On the dais, we heard representatives from the European Union, talking about France and the EU having the option for positive cooperation with the Chinese. There was a less enthusiastic response, I think, from DoD as we heard. What's the right way to approach this, given that at a time when we were in a truly existential competition with the Soviet Union, we were able to find cooperation?
Well, the cooperation that we had with the Soviet Union during the Cold War was actually relatively modest. It had some scientific cooperation. There were certain exchanges. When we brought samples back from the moon, we exchanged some of those with the Soviet Union. They provided some samples that they eventually returned from the moon. The case of human space cooperation, the Apollo-Soyuz test mission you mentioned, was really a one-off mission that grew out of a summit meeting between President Nixon and Premier Brezhnev in 1972, and that was symbolizing an era of détente. And I think that's very important because it makes the point that cooperation follows politics. It doesn't precede it. When the political environment was pretty tough, yes, there were ways to have small, low-level, reciprocal, no technology transfer kinds of scientific exchanges. I think such exchanges are certainly possible with China today, but I think human space cooperation requires a different level of trust. We've developed actually a good working relationship with our Russian counterparts. We brought Russia into the space station in part because we wanted to symbolize a post-Soviet era. Would we do the same thing again today? Probably not, because the political conditions are actually quite different today. Nonetheless, at a working level, we do like and appreciate our Russian counterparts, but the political environment certainly is not as good as it once was. And I think as we look at China, we also have to say, well, what are the political conditions and what level of cooperation, I think, could we justify and support? I think in this regards, the language that we've used from several summit meetings, that is, we are interested in cooperation which is reciprocal, transparent, mutually beneficial, is what we can do. And again, I can imagine some low-level scientific activities that are transparent, reciprocal, and mutually beneficial. I have a much harder time imagining in human spaceflight, because human spaceflight carries a degree of political trust, it carries a degree of symbolism that I think is really hard for the current state of relations to support.
Do you think that there could be, for example, a Mars mission or anything else on which, perhaps an unmanned mission in which cooperation with China would be possible at this point, or even in the near future?
Probably not. I could imagine coordination of activities. I could imagine, for example, China landing on the moon in a location that was, say, selected in cooperation with the United States, bringing back a sample that we would find of interest, of us providing a sample to China that they would find of interest. But it's a much more disciplined and regulated sort of environment without technology transfer. The thing you have to keep into mind is that in the case of China with their government, there really is no such thing as a civil program. When you're dealing with China in space, you're dealing with the People's Liberation Army. That's just a fact. And so the kind of cooperation that we can have with China is going to be intrinsically limited given the political situation that we find ourselves in.
Dr. Pace, thanks very much. Executive Secretary of the National Space Council, sir. Always a pleasure talking to you. Best of luck in the job. And there are so many other questions I want to ask you. Look forward to getting together with you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vago. Good to see you again.